They were smiling when they walked into that courtroom. My uncle had his hand on my aunt's back, guiding her like they were walking into a dinner party. She was wearing a cream blazer. He had a new haircut. They looked like people who had already won. I watched them from across the room and I thought, you have no idea what's in that folder on my attorney's table. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I was 7 years old the first time I understood that not everyone's family loves them. It was a Tuesday in November, and my parents were driving me to my grandmother's house in rural Tennessee. A 3-hour trip we made every Thanksgiving. I remember I had my backpack in my lap because I'd brought my favorite book, a worn paperback about a girl who trains horses, and I was reading it in the back seat while the radio played something low and country. My dad was driving. My mom was asleep against the passenger window, her breath fogging the glass. We stopped at a gas station outside of Cookeville. My dad told me to stay in the car. I didn't. I needed to use the restroom, and I was 7 and didn't think twice about pushing open the car door and following him inside. I remember the smell of the place, burnt coffee and pine-scented floor cleaner. I remember the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I went to the bathroom, and when I came back out, I stood at the end of the snack aisle and watched my dad talking on a payphone. I didn't understand everything I heard. I was 7. But I understood his tone, which was the voice he used when he thought no one was listening, and I understood certain words. She doesn't know. We'll leave her there. Mother will figure it out. I got back in the car before he came back. I didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I just held my book tighter and watched the highway and told myself I'd misheard. Kids mishear things all the time. We got to my grandmother's house that evening. It was already dark. The porch light was on and I could smell her pot roast from the driveway, and she came out to meet us before we even knocked. Because she always did that. She wrapped her arms around me first, the way she always did, and said, "There's my girl," against the top of my head. My parents didn't stay for dinner. They said they had to head back. That something had come up with the house. My mom hugged me quickly, her perfume sharp and familiar, and my dad ruffled my hair and said, "Be good for Gran." And then the car backed out of the gravel driveway, and the taillights disappeared around the bend in the road. I stood on the porch and watched them go. My grandmother stood behind me with her hand on my shoulder. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Let's go eat, sweetheart," and she turned me gently toward the door. They never came back, not for Christmas, not for my birthday in March, not for the following Thanksgiving, not ever. My grandmother told me the truth in small pieces over the next several months, the way you do with a child. She didn't want to shatter me all at once. My parents had been struggling, there had been debt, there had been other problems she didn't name, not to me, not then. They had decided they couldn't take care of me. They had decided, and this was the part she told me last, and quietly, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with both of her hands wrapped around mine, that it was better for everyone if I stayed with her. Better for everyone. I was 7 years old. I had my horse book and 2 changes of clothes and a backpack with a broken zipper. My grandmother's name was June Calloway. She was 63 years old when I came to live with her, a widow of 12 years with a small piece of land outside of Cookeville that had been in her family for 4 generations. She grew tomatoes in the summer and kept 2 cats named after jazz musicians. She watched Jeopardy every single night, and she was better at it than anyone I've ever known. She made sweet tea so strong, it made your mouth pucker. She drove a 1991 Ford pickup that she referred to as the truck, and would get visibly annoyed if you called it anything else. She became, in every way that matters, my mother. I know what that sounds like. It sounds like the kind of line people use when they want to make a loss feel tidy. But I mean it plainly and without decoration. She is the person who raised me. She is the reason I know how to be a person. She's the one who helped me with my homework at the kitchen table every night, who drove me to school in the dark during winter, who sat in the bleachers at every one of my track meets, even when her knees were bothering her. She's the one who taught me to change a tire, to balance a checkbook, to make her biscuit recipe by feel instead of measurement. She's the one who held me when I cried about my parents. I did, more than I want to admit. Even knowing what they'd done, you don't stop loving people just because they hurt you. I learned that the hard way, and she was the one who helped me understand that that was okay too. She got her affairs in order when I was in college. I was 20, finishing my second year at UT Knoxville on a partial scholarship I'd supplemented with 2 part-time jobs, and she called me one Sunday afternoon and said she'd been to see her attorney. She said she'd updated her will. She said she wanted me to know that everything, the land, the house, the savings she'd accumulated over decades of careful, quiet living, was going to me. I told her to stop talking like that. She laughed and told me she wasn't going anywhere, but that a woman her age needed to be practical. She said, "I want you to have the life I couldn't give your mother. I want you to have something that lasts," I cried after we hung up. I was sitting in the parking lot of the grocery store where I worked weekends, and I just sat there with my hands in my lap and cried, because I couldn't figure out how I'd gotten lucky enough to have her, and because I was also terrified of the day I wouldn't. That day came 5 years later. She passed away 2 weeks after my 25th birthday in the same house where she'd been born. Congestive heart failure. She'd been managing it for 2 years and had hidden the worst of it from me. I think also because she was stubborn in the most wonderful way a person can be stubborn. The hospice nurse told me afterward that she'd been incredibly calm at the end, that she'd asked to have the window open, that she'd seemed, in the nurse's word, ready. The estate was appraised at just over $1.3 million. The land alone was worth most of that. Property values in Middle Tennessee had increased significantly in the decade before she died. She had 42 acres that backed up to a creek, and a developer had actually approached her 3 years earlier with an offer she'd turned down flat. There was also the house itself, her savings, some small investments my grandfather had made decades ago, and she'd left untouched, and a life insurance policy she'd been paying into since the 1970s. I found out the total from her attorney, a man named Mr. Greer, who had handled her affairs for 30 years and clearly adored her. He had a framed photo of her on his bookshelf. That detail nearly broke me, standing there in his office. He walked me through everything methodically, and when he was done, he slid a copy of the will across the desk to me and said she'd been very clear about her intentions, very specific. She'd left everything to me, her only living family, as she'd listed me in the document. Her only living family. Those 4 words would matter a great deal 3 months later when my uncle called. I hadn't heard from him in years. He was my grandmother's son, her only child by blood, my mother's older brother, and he and I had a relationship best described as distant. He'd been at her funeral. He'd hugged me in the way that people hug at funerals, brief and obligatory, and said something like she loved you so much. And then he'd driven back to Nashville with his wife, and I hadn't spoken to him since. So when his name appeared on my phone that Tuesday afternoon, I answered mostly out of surprise. He said he'd been thinking about the estate. He said he was glad everything was taken care of. He said he hoped I was doing okay. And then he said, "We've been talking to some people, and we think there might be some questions about the will." I went very still. He kept talking. He said that my grandmother had been elderly and in poor health when she'd updated her documents. He said he had concerns about her state of mind. He said that as her biological son, blood family, he felt he had a rightful claim to at least a portion of the estate, and that his attorney believed there were grounds to challenge. I asked him if he was serious. He said he was. He said he hoped we could handle it civilly. I said, "She was completely clear-minded until the end. You know that." He said, "Our attorney thinks a jury might see it differently." I hung up. I sat on my couch for about 45 minutes without moving. I thought about my grandmother at her kitchen table, walking me through her will over the phone, her voice steady and precise. I thought about Mr. Greer telling me she'd been very specific. I thought about the nurse saying she'd been ready, and then I got up and called my own attorney. Her name is Linda, and she's been practicing estate law in Tennessee for over 20 years, and when I explained the situation, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do." The claim my uncle filed was based on undue influence. The argument that I had somehow manipulated my grandmother into leaving me the estate. His attorneys also raised the question of testamentary capacity, suggesting she hadn't been mentally competent when she updated her will. Both of those arguments had a fundamental problem. My grandmother had updated her will 4 years before she died. Not in her final days, not during her illness. 4 years before, when she was healthy and sharp and still winding at Jeopardy every night. Mr. Greer had documented the process thoroughly, as good estate attorneys do. He had notes from multiple meetings. He had a letter she'd dictated in her own words, explaining her intentions and the reasoning behind them. He had records showing she had explicitly discussed her estrangement from her son and her decision, deliberate, considered, made over years, to leave her estate to me. There was also the matter of her medical records. 2 different physicians had seen her regularly in the years prior to the will update. Both documented her as cognitively intact. Both were prepared to testify. And then there was the other thing. My uncle had not seen my grandmother more than twice in the decade before she died. I had records of this. Not because I'd been collecting them strategically, but because my grandmother had kept a journal. She'd kept one her whole adult life. I found them in a box in her closet after she passed, 40 years of composition notebooks in her small, careful handwriting. She'd written about his absence. She'd written about it more than once. She'd written, in the year she updated her will, a passage that Mr. Greer read aloud in the attorney's office when we were preparing our response, and his voice was completely steady, which I respected, because mine would not have been. She'd written, "I have thought hard about what I owe to blood and what I owe to love. They are not always the same. Some people earn a place in your life, others simply expect one." My uncle and his wife sat across from us in that courtroom, and they smiled, because they thought they were going to walk away with something that had never belonged to them. They had driven up from Nashville in what I was later told was a new SUV. They had a team of 2 attorneys. They had expressions that I can only describe as confident. I thought about what my grandmother used to say when I was in high school and nervous before track meets. She'd hand me a cup of tea, too strong always, and she'd say, "You know what you've put in, let the race show it." The judge reviewed the motion to dismiss that Linda had filed. She read the documentation, the will update timeline, the physician's statements, Mr. Greer's records, the journal entries which Linda had submitted as exhibits with my uncle's full knowledge, because she'd notified his attorneys in advance. The judge looked at the room. She said the claim of undue influence was unsupported by the evidence. She said the claim of lack of testamentary capacity was directly contradicted by medical documentation and the attorney's contemporaneous records. She said that the evidence indicated, in her words, a clear and consistent pattern of intentional estate planning over a period of years. She dismissed the case. My uncle didn't say anything when it was over. He gathered his things and his wife gathered hers, and they walked out without looking at me. I watched them go and I didn't feel what I expected to feel. I thought I'd feel triumphant maybe, or angry or something loud. I felt tired, and then underneath that, something quieter. I felt like I'd kept a promise. Linda touched my arm and said congratulations, and Mr. Greer, who had come to observe, who hadn't been required to be there, shook my hand and said my grandmother would have been pleased, and I believed him because he'd known her for 30 years and I trusted his read on that more than almost anyone's. I drove home on the same highway I'd taken 100 times since childhood, past the gas station outside of Cookville, where I'd heard my father's voice on a payphone at age 7, and understood, in some wordless way, that something was ending. I thought about my parents. I do, sometimes, not with anger anymore, mostly with a kind of sad distance, the way you feel about a place you used to live in that doesn't exist anymore. I don't know where they are. I've never tried to find out. My grandmother never spoke badly of them to me, not once, and I've tried to hold on to that. The land is mine now, the house, the 42 acres that back up to the creek, where the water runs shallow over flat limestone rocks and the tree canopy in summer is so thick it feels like a different world. I'm not selling it. I go back every few weeks and I walk the property and I let the cats in. There are new ones now, also named after jazz musicians, because I couldn't not. And I sit on the porch and I drink tea that I make too strong on purpose. I planted tomatoes in the spring. They're coming in now. She would have had opinions about how I staked them. She would have told me I was doing it wrong, and then shown me the right way with her hands, and I would have listened and I would have remembered. I'm still learning how to do it without her. Most things I'm still learning. But the land is mine. She made sure of it. And every time I walk out into that summer heat, and I see those 42 acres stretching out green and quiet toward the creek, I hear her voice the same way I always hear it when something good happens. "There's my girl.